Please be seated.
Good afternoon. Thanks everyone so much for coming. The wonderful irony that my great-grandfather left Russia in the 19th century to avoid the life of a rabbi having to wear old-fashioned black, large, ill-fitting garments. Here I am, honored to wear them. Thanks everyone very much for coming. It's great to see so many ex-colleagues from different environments and new colleagues from government, colleagues from research environments, colleagues in research centres and projects, and new colleagues in the department. I've chosen an ambitious title for my talk today, by which I don't mean to suggest that I know what the best social science is or that I do it, but that it is important in trying to bring research and evidence to bear on policy thinking, that we have a sense of what that is. And so I'm going to give you my view. And I really appreciate so many of you coming today. Obviously, I am an academic and it's a lecture, so you've taken a big risk. This could go on. I will limit it and feel free to hold me to that. But I do want to set out some of my personal view, I suppose, about what the best social science is, why we need social science. I feel like the challenge of bringing information to bear in policy and practice needs social science, but social science has kind of lost out to other disciplines. The scientific panel of the Department for Education in Westminster has economists, has philosophers, it has biologists, has medics, it has psychiatrists. I'm not sure it has anyone who would define themselves as a social scientist in the sense that I want to define it. And I think that's partly a problem for social science in how it makes its case in a world of policy and practice. I also think it's a problem for policy and practice. So I'm trying to make an argument here that we need good social science, and social science needs to have a sense of what that is so that it can be credible and persuasive in the argument that it makes. So this is a kind of two-sided challenge. So that's the brief talk that I want to give today. I also want to talk a little bit about a project that I've worked on for the last few years with colleagues also represented here, about how to bring voice and some other elements of information into the practice of local government decision-making particularly. So that is an application of some principles of social science in how they might help us improve policy and practice. And I want to argue that is an essentially democratic challenge. And so I'm going to take you through a few slides to try and make my point here. I should say there's a huge amount of expertise in this room, and on any slide there will be things that many of you know a lot more about than I do. You will all have views and expert opinions, and I look forward to discussion afterwards. You can remind me of all the things that I don't know about all of these points I'm going to make. But that's academic life, and that's wonderful. There'll be a few pictures. You're free to cheer or boo as you wish. I wanted to start here. Michael Barber, who also started in education, and was reappointed by Prime Minister in 2024 to help shape the way this administration thinks about the delivery of public services. How do we meet our goals that are set for the new government? How does the government deliver its manifesto? And this is about, essential to this is how information is used, which is why I say it's critical to the thesis that I'm putting forward. And I'm emphasizing as well that in announcing Michael Barber as a return into the centre of government in 2024, he'd been very influential in the Blair years, as many of you will know, in shaping the way public services were thought about, the way information was used, the way accountability worked, the way reform operated to try and bring about the outcomes that the government had set for itself, one of which was then and continues to be what's called here breaking down barriers of opportunity. And I emphasize that because that is a social scientific challenge. It's very hard to think about barriers of opportunity just at the level of the child. just at the level of the family. We have to think about society as a whole and the way in which it operates, which requires a social science, I would argue. So we long-term challenge for government of how do we break down barriers of opportunity. It can be expressed in many ways. People might talk about the attainment gap. They might talk about social mobility. They might talk about poverty. They might talk about intergenerational inequality, a whole series of themes which are about the nature of our society and how it evolves and changes through time. And implicit within that is the notion of, I would say, power, or access to resources, access to opportunity, which again, essential principle of social science, that we have to understand the dynamic relationships between individuals, not just as unique individuals floating through space, but as operating with access to resources of power and influence, essential to social science. So just a bit of history to make sure everyone's clear about where we're coming from as we think about this challenge of reducing barriers to opportunity or achieving social justice. You don't have to go very far back. Could have picked other examples. Court laws, 16th century. Any able-bodied person out of work for 3 days could be enslaved for 2 years and branded with a V. So power dynamics essential to the structure of our society. And we've come a long way from then. We no longer have slavery or the right to enslave children for being vagabond. And how have we got there? I would say the principles of rights has been essential to that. And it's difficult to talk about rights in a social scientific framework if you're only thinking about biology and psychiatry and individuated kind of discourses. Rights, again, exist as a way of framing the relationship between the individual and the state, and big arguments about the role that rights should play in our society, and we don't have time to really bottom those out, but I just want to emphasize the importance within a social scientific framework, and it's part of, I would say, the contribution of social science to be able to build rights into how we think about questions about how public services might operate and might operate best. Just to emphasize, again, just a single example from history, from our journey to where we are now. John Locke quoted in the United States Declaration of Independence, and I emphasize we hold these truths to be self-evident because these are our moral values. We can't evidence and prove and test beliefs about rights and values. So a mechanistic social science that seeks to establish a set of fundamental dynamic principles which determine all outcomes is not going to help us understand the distribution of resources across a body of people, which is about a question of values and a question of rights. Interesting also, just in terms of the history of how we've come to be where we are, John Locke, in writing the second treatise that he published, which fed into the Declaration of Independence, the first treatise was an argument against a chap called Filmer, who'd written a book, Patriarcha, which made the philosophical case for the persecution of witches on the grounds of philosophical premises, which again just emphasizes the point that when we're thinking about rights and values, these are self-evident. Ultimately, these come from our own senses of reality and won't be established in fundamental senses by empirical study, which I think is a challenge for social science and part of the challenge of social science. A couple of other historical references, Eglantine Jebb, who was a student in Lady Margaret Hall just over the road, and who set up Save the Children Fund as an attempt to try and bring support to the children in the defeated nations after the First World War, Save the Children Fund. And she wrote the Declaration of the Rights of the Child for Save the Children, which then became a year later the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or ultimately became that document, drafted over the road, as I understand it, in Lady Margaret Hall by Eglantine Jebb. She also moved to Cambridge at some point did a study of the economy of Cambridge, and this was the frontispiece from her book, which I like to quote. If you can see the sort of skeletal figures here, confronting the board of the local government of Cambridge at that time and saying to them, give an account of your stewardship, or ye may no longer be stewards, which I think is important in terms of how we understand accountability, the accountability of the powerful for their use of their power, rather than accountability as it tends to be used in public services, cascaded through the system to the weakest within the system. But again, power, dynamic access to resources, essential to this argument about how do we address inequalities, barriers to opportunity, and so on. So it's a challenging field, social science. I need to touch a little bit on methods, because I want to make the argument that we need social science, and why social science is a bit different to other sciences. Because I think that's part of the challenge of why government likes the biologists and the psychiatrists who can adopt what appears to be a more objective, hard-nosed, mathematical, scientific explanation of reality. We have to make the case for why a different form of understanding of reality is necessary, and social science can do that. But there are challenges. So this, if you think about the biological world, we have a very easy understanding, I say easy, hard-won understanding of levels of organization within biology. We know the difference between a cell and an organ. And biologists can look at matter, they can study it in different ways, and they can understand how it fits within a wider system. What level of organization does it fit at? And that's structured and it's universally agreed across biology, and there's a common language, which put the skeleton in just to emphasize the importance of a system and the understanding of the relationship between the parts, which is also essential to social science. It's the dynamic between the different parts that enables effective functioning rather than just the focus on any one component. Whereas when we come to social science, it is more difficult in the sense that we don't have easy and natural, universally agreed, observable levels of analysis. We have Bronfenbrenner and others, and this fundamental framing that people would have seen in Every Child Matters and in other places, starting from the child and then broadening out to the immediate family, kinship and informal networks, local environment, and the broader economy. But where are the boundaries of those things? Every study might place that in a slightly different way. There's no formal scientific definition of the level at which we understand a meso unit or a macro unit within social science, I would say. And we have to take account in trying to understand the child, if we're thinking about education or children's social care. We have to understand the child through the lens of some of the elements that I've just brought out on the right-hand side there, none of which are easy and universally definable. So place and time, really important. Everybody exists at a place and exists through time, and they have an identity. We don't start as a set of universal, common individual units operating within a social model. We exist with an identity that is complex and has relationships around it. And we operate then in a world that has institutions. This is our social world. And at the macro level to all of this, we have to deal with culture and history and technology as the context within which we're trying to understand how the child's life is experienced, how social services, how welfare and health and children's social care and everything else operates in the life of the child. We have to understand it in the context of all of those things, which are not easily reducible to a small number of variables that can be modeled in a linear regression or in a quasi-experimental design. That's the reality of the life that we operate within, and social science has to recognize that. So it's different to the other sciences. One of the key ways in which I would say it's different to other sciences is, as I said earlier about power, we operate as individuals within those power structures. And so we have to understand when we're studying the world, we're also operating in that same world. And for social science, that's probably biting for all sciences, but it's particularly biting for social sciences where people are operating within systems of power. So just to emphasize that point, this slide. So this chap, Francis Galton, some of you will know. Just a bit of history. The chap at the top there is Erasmus Darwin, and his two grandchildren there through different marriages, I understand. One was Charles Darwin, this chap, Theory of Evolution. His relative, Francis Galton, did a huge number of studies, was the inventor of the notion of eugenics, tried to simplify notions of race into notions of species, lost the distinction between species and races, propagated a model of power that put the European white male at the top in terms of innate capabilities, and other races and groups further down in a hierarchy that he believed was designed by genetics. And that was his starting point. And he set about to try and prove that. One of the studies he did, he looked in I can't remember exactly, was it Debrett's or some other book of the great and the good at the time in which he was living, and found that they were all related, and used this as proof that they were therefore genetically, so completely failing to understand the social context. And then invented twin studies as a model that was at least better at getting towards something that had some independent identification of a causal effect, if you like, although still flawed in many ways, and save that discussion for another time. But my point is he started from the assumption of his own greatness. And that's why positionality is an essential principle of social science, that if we're not asking ourselves, why are we asking the questions that we're asking, and how are we going to understand the answers, then we risk perpetuating those same biases. So again, I say that's the fundamental principle of good social science. So moving on to a different view around public services and thinking about the role of the state in people's lives, if we're thinking about children's social care or education. Number of references on here. Many of you will know the street level bureaucrat notion. I mean, essentially that children and families to really achieve improvements in development and in the lives of individuals, we do have to think about the macroeconomy. We do have to think about culture and technology, but we also have a set of public services which are involved in the lives of children and families. And in those, there are practitioners who are in relationships with children and families, and it is the quality of those relationships that is essential to the achievement of progress. Not enough in itself, because you've still got the macro context in which that is operating, or the place level context in which that is operating, but it's an essential component of it. And just emphasizing the de Leon point there, that we need to see implementation, therefore, of public services as involving negotiation and bargaining between those who put policy into effect and those upon whom action depends. So again, essential notion of legitimacy and consent, an inherent element of a social scientific understanding of how individuals and public services interact, or the way in which society operates. And just emphasizing Hilary Cotham's work there, trying to build a relational model of public services. What do public services look like? And indeed, what does social science look like if we put relationships at the center rather than individuals as atomistic units operating within a kind of simple model of the universe? If we really try and understand relationships, things get a lot more complex. And it's a challenge for social science, I would say, really to understand a relational model of the world that goes up through those levels from the individual up to the macro. It's challenging, but I think is an important part of the research agenda for us. So emphasizing the point of the the practitioner who is in a relationship, as well as the other relationships that exist around children and families. How do we use information and evidence and social science to support the improvement of those relationships is the challenge. And just, I just wanted to bring us then to a particular project that I've been involved in that is about the use of information to try to improve outcomes. There is this essential idea, I suppose, that by having better understanding of outcomes, by looking at development through time, by observing the way public services are interacting with children and families, we can better understand what's going on and we can improve outcomes. And I would say it's an essential principle within the operation of central government at this point, and indeed within many local authorities. We need dashboards, we need data, we need analytics. And if only we had better analytics, we would understand what was going on, we'd be able to solve these social problems. Indeed, I think I'm right, and people here can correct me, that Dominic Cummings at one point, as advisor to Boris Johnson, was of the view that if we just got all the data and fed it into the right machine learning program, we would understand what we have to do. And again, we need social science, we need to understand the data we're using, we need theory around it in order to begin to understand what is going on in that set of relationships. But we need that theory. And so there is, but nonetheless, data and information can be useful. But although many people believe that, and although there's a lot of pressure from central government on local authorities to collect information, there isn't a lot of evidence, indeed much at all, that actually gathering more information is actually going to improve outcomes in any way. We don't have many good tests of that. I could show you a lot of dashboards. You will have seen a lot of dashboards that land on people's tables and are never used in any meaningful way at all. Anybody who's working anywhere near practice will know about the burden of these things on practitioners and on local authorities, a huge mass of data gathering. How much of it really informs any policy and practice? And any study that I've seen of it will show you actually very, very little. I could talk about the Section 251 statistics that DFE in their beneficence collect that tell central government about how local authorities are spending money in relation to children. Very useful in responding to parliamentary questions, but deeply inaccurate because it's not used at a local authority level. And I've seen studies of this. But this perpetuates because I would say there is a challenge about how good the public debate is about how evidence and information is used by government. It's not subject to critique from journalists and the media or other MPs. It just carries on. And the challenge is, how do we break through this and have better use of information that is respective of the central point I want to make about social science as a critical realist? I've been trying to make the argument that we have to have a social science that respects the reality of the thing we're trying to study. You can't study society through a telescope or a microscope. So we need the right tools, and in using social science in government, we need government that understands the realities of the things that are being studied and the methods for studying it. So this project is just an attempt to try and test out some ideas in that space, and huge thanks to Elaine Charland, who's here, co-investigator on that project, particularly leading in relation to how we integrate voice information alongside statistical information and other forms of information. I should thank Nuffield Foundation for funding this as a 5-year project. I wanted to mention it partly because it's an example of an attempt to achieve a strategic goal through using information. The strategic challenge that this project took on was about how local authorities use information to improve outcomes. Can they do that? Does better uses of information really lead to improved outcomes for children and families? And as we try and do that, what do we learn about the challenges of using information? And it's a collaboration we're working in 4 local authority areas in depth over 5 years, and a number of universities, and also working with Research in Practice, who work closely with local authorities around how they use information. And huge thanks to Nuffield for funding this over 5 years, and for colleagues. We're coming to the end of it. And it's been a fascinating journey around the challenges of working closely with local authorities in their uses of information. But it does parallel some of the challenges in central government, and I think has some learning that I'll conclude on. Just to say, when we're talking about information, we're talking about everything that might be important to know and consider about children, young people and their families. So it might be formal information that is gathered as data. It might be information in case records. It might not be codified or collected within administrative data systems, but that huge wealth of information is available to local authorities in their practice. We're interested to see how they might use that. The point about information use is really important here in terms of how the information is used. At the moment, most information that is gathered by local authorities is used to report to central government in response to the provision of funds, rather than to understand their local populations, to understand needs in a rich sense, or to understand how services are interacting. But essential to this project is that information that is gathered be used, because as I've been emphasizing, the use has to relate to the information that is gathered. Is it fit for the purpose for which we want to use it? Does the information, as academics, we do this all the time. You set off on a research study, you need to gather information that's going to actually test the thing you want to test or study the thing you want to study. It's not the way it works in the government. The question is, what have we got? Can we use it? Will it seem relevant? Is it good enough? I guess is maybe the generous way to ask the question. But I would say it's never really asked in a very profound way. So we've been asking about the use of information, which does mean processing and collation and collection, but also then the use of it in decision making. And that's one of the big challenges in trying to integrate voice information into decision making, is how does it actually get into decision making structures rather than getting lost. And a number of the studies that we've done in these 4 local authorities shows that the voice information that is gathered just gets lost as information gets collated, gets thinned out, and what goes up to decision-making bodies is averages on national statistics, which Galton might be very pleased with. You get your linear distribution, and you can do a bit of Gaussian statistics, but we've lost everything that tells us about the real life experiences of the people whose services we are trying to improve. So use is essential. We've been working in 4 sites, and it's a big project with a lot of colleagues. I'm just going to talk about 2 of them, Oldham and Rochdale, which are around early years, for which, following Barber at the top, so Michael Barber, government has committed to a new target. We have a goal of 75% of children achieving the good level of development on the early years foundation stage at age 5. It's a very laudable goal. Fascinating working in Oldham and Rochdale on the reality of who their children are and how utterly, I'm afraid to say, meaningless that target is in the lives of those children. And it's a really good example of how the challenge of how information gets used at different levels within the system. Because I wouldn't want to argue the Prime Minister's wrong to make a commitment on early years, but how does that commitment get cascaded through the system? How much real work has gone on to understand that and think about how that target setting influences practice at the local level? And so again, I want to make an argument, and this is part of the point of the work, is to democratize the information use. So rather than asking, what information do we need at a prime ministerial level to make a speech at a party conference, we ask, what information do early years providers in Oldham need in order to understand what's going on in family life, or indeed what information do children and families feel should be relevant? So the work in Rochdale has been about how do local families, particularly ethnic minority families in a particularly deprived ward of Rochdale, how do they define school readiness? What do they need in order to be able to achieve the goal that might be measured in terms of early years foundation stage, but actually to them might mean a whole series of different concepts that are more the focus of what they're working on as practitioners? And how do we have an adequate conversation between those practitioners and those families that might lead to real inclusion and involvement and some degree of autonomy and engagement in early learning? It's a very different model than the top-down model, which makes sense from maybe an upper 10 standpoint. And similar projects going on across those 4 sites, and really interesting testing the co-production with a local authority. What information do they actually need to improve a service area? and 4 very different projects. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of what their information needs are. And just about, I'm going to make a couple more remarks before I close. One is, one of the main pieces of learning, I would say, from a few generations of evidence-based policymaking, of testing practices to see what works, to develop interventions, roll them out, learn, test. They take 30, 40, 50, 60 years to really, really operate in a very effective way. David Old's Family Nurse Partnership, classic example, took 40 years before it was really showing something that was replicable and achievable in different contexts. The government's still capable of picking up and putting it in the wrong context and evaluating it against the wrong outcomes. But it took 40 years, and it's a really important point, is how do we convince senior policymakers that they have to allow evaluation to take its time? Sure Start, great example. How many of us were having to defend Sure Start and support the evaluation studies that there were to a government that was saying this project has failed after 12 years, and then 15 years later we get the evaluation that shows very substantial long-term impacts. That's over a 25-year cycle. So how do we persuade policymakers they can't chase the immediate evaluation of a study that hasn't even been completed yet? I could give you examples of that. So we know these things take a long time, and I want to make the same case for these projects. They need time to develop. It's a big challenge to work with local authorities to use information properly, and I hope that kind of work can continue, because they're thriving on this work. They're really loving it and getting a lot from it and feeling much better able to engage with the demands of central government around information. Now they've had a chance to understand how it might work for them. So this is my final slide, which is just the kind of synthesis of that work in the 4 sites, what we've learned about the set of practices that are necessary for a local authority to really think about how it's going to use information, and I'm going to say ethically and effectively. And a lot of this talk has been about the definition for me of ethical and effective. So in a way that respects rights, that democratizes, that includes consent and engagement and inclusion at its heart, but also ensures that information is used effectively. It doesn't get lost in case files, and it supports improvement to lives, experiences, and outcomes. And the essential argument of this project is you actually need to do both to achieve the effective. That if you don't do the ethical, if you don't have engagement and inclusion and participation at the heart of how you're thinking about research and evidence and indeed policy making, you won't have effective public services, because of this essential principle of legitimacy, which is at the heart of our framework of understanding of democracy from Locke and elsewhere. So finally, I just want to say, so glad so many of you can come today. Everyone in the department has their own research agenda. This is a place of autonomy and agency. And I'm not expecting anybody else to follow this sort of lecture as a framework for anything. But I do think we have to think hard about how we convince policymakers and how we build impact into our thinking. And it's a two-way conversation, I suppose, that I want to emphasize, that I think there's challenge on both sides of this, both for academics about how relevant their work is, how the training and the teaching we're doing, how much of that is really supporting the children's workforce, the issues of today, something I want us as a department to be asking at least, but also for policymakers. How do we have a better conversation? I'm very familiar with the real world. I'm very familiar with this train is leaving the station. This is the train. This is the one to be on. The world of policymaking is a difficult world, and you can't expect as academics to just jump on the train of your choosing. But if we don't have a better conversation, we're not making any improvement really on barriers to opportunity, because we're not understanding the dynamics from a fully social scientific standpoint. Thank you.
Please rise.